If you have a significant RRSP account and you're approaching or in retirement, there's a good chance you thought about how much tax you're going to have to pay once you start making withdrawals. You're probably familiar with the idea of an RRSP meltdown, and you might even have a rough plan in place. But the one thing that makes the difference between a meltdown that works and one that just moves money around, and I know this is going to sound a bit funny, but it's the relentless pursuit of optimizing the tax bracket you take it out at. We've had this conversation hundreds of times, and what's interesting is that sometimes a meltdown is exactly the right move, and other times it's the last thing that should be happening. And the reason for that usually comes down to whether that tax bracket piece is being handled properly or not at all. So what I want to do in this video is get us on the same page about what a meltdown actually is, but more importantly, what makes it work and where it quietly starts to fall apart. And just quickly, we help Canadians coordinate exactly these kinds of decisions. So if you want us to look at your specific RRSP situation, there's a link down in the description. Now, before we get too far into this, it's probably worth just quickly grounding what we mean when we say RRSP meltdown. At its core, all it really is deliberately drawing down your RRSP earlier than required, rather than waiting until the government forces those withdrawals through the RRIF minimums later on. And the reason people even consider doing that is because they're trying to avoid a situation later in life where those forced withdrawals push them into higher tax brackets than necessary. So instead of letting that income build up and get taxed all at once down the road, the idea is to start pulling some of it forward into earlier years when income is lower and taxed a bit more efficiently. Just to put something simple behind that, let's say someone retires at 60 with $1 million in their RRSP, and they decide to leave it alone for as long as possible. So maybe they're living off a non-registered account or they're a TFSA, so there's no real need to touch it. In the meantime, the RRSP keeps growing, which on the surface is a great problem to have. But fast forward to age 71, that account now has to convert to a RRIF. And let's just say that it's grown to around $2 million. At that point, the withdrawals are no longer optional, and right out of the gate, they're forced to take out over $100,000 per year. And that's happening at the same time as you're receiving income from CPP and OAS. So now all of that income is stacking up. That's what pushes them into a much higher tax bracket, and in a lot of cases starts triggering the OAS clawback. And that's really only part of the issue, because at death, the tax consequences become even worse. If there's a surviving spouse, it rolls over to them tax-free, but eventually when that second spouse passes, or if you're single, the entire balance of those registered accounts is treated as income in that 1 year. And depending on the size of the account, you can easily start losing 50% of it to taxes. So the whole idea behind the meltdown isn't just to take money out earlier for the sake of it, it's to smooth out how that income is taken over time, so you're not forced into those higher tax brackets later on, and you're not leaving that kind of tax bill behind at the end. Now that all sounds pretty reasonable, and in a lot of cases it is, but where this starts to get a bit fuzzy is how that idea actually gets applied in practice. Because when most Canadians hear this, they translate it into something pretty straightforward. Start taking money out earlier, and as long as you're not in the top tax bracket, you're probably ahead of the game. And again, on the surface, that feels like you're doing exactly what we just described. And a lot of people we meet would say that's what they're doing today. They start withdrawals, they've got a plan, and it looks like a meltdown. But when you zoom in on what's actually happening year to year, that's usually where things start to come undone. Because the RRSP meltdown isn't really about how much you take out. It's about the tax bracket you take it out at. That's the shift. It's not withdrawal management, it's bracket management. And that might sound like a small distinction, but in practice, it changes everything. Because once you start looking at it that way, the question stops being how much should we withdraw this year, and it becomes how much room do we have in our tax brackets, and how do we use it? And those are two very different ways of making the same decision. Most people assume that their tax rate in retirement will naturally be lower than it was while they were working. And in some cases, that's true. But what tends to happen is that income starts to stack in ways that aren't always obvious. You've got CPP coming in, OAS layered on top, and eventually those RRIF minimums get forced on top of that too. So instead of income going down, it often compresses into fewer years at higher levels. That's where the brackets start to matter, because the goal here isn't just to take out money earlier, it's to take it out in a range where it's consistently taxed at a lower rate year after year. There's a bit of a sweet spot to this where income is high enough that you're actually drawing down the RRSP in a meaningful way, but not so high that each additional dollar is getting pushed into a much higher tax bracket. So now the strategy starts to look different. Instead of pulling money out based on need, you're deliberately filling up that range each year. And then the next year you do it again, same bracket, same discipline, and over time that spreads the taxable income from that RRSP over a much longer period. And this is also where the connection to CPP timing starts to come in, because if CPP is turned on earlier, well, that's going to fill up that bottom tax bracket for you, which leaves less room to draw from the RRSP efficiently. But if CPP is delayed, it creates that gap in those early retirement years where your income is lower, and that's exactly what allows the meltdown to actually work the way it was intended to. So now it's not just one decision anymore. It's not, should I melt down my RRSP? It becomes, what bracket am I trying to stay in? And how do my RRSP withdrawals, CPP timing, and other sources of income all work together to fill it properly? And that's the part most people never really see. Now, this is where things start to get a bit more nuanced, because even if you understand that this is about managing your tax bracket, it still doesn't automatically mean that doing a meltdown is the right move. And this is where a lot of the conversations we have tend to shift, because there are situations where pulling money out early, even if you're doing it deliberately, actually makes the outcome worse, not better. The easiest way to think about it is this. If you're already in a relatively high tax bracket in retirement, taking more money out of your RRSP doesn't really solve a problem. It just accelerates the taxes you were going to pay anyway, but at a rate that might actually not be favorable. So for example, let's say someone retires and between CPP, OAS, pension income, and other sources, they're already sitting in a 40% plus marginal tax bracket. At that point, doing a meltdown means voluntarily pulling more money into that same bracket or even pushing into a higher one. So now the decision becomes a bit different. Is it better to pay 40% today or allow that money to continue growing tax deferred and potentially pay 50% on it much later? And for most people, that sounds like an easy answer at first. But when you actually run the numbers, it's not that straightforward. Because what tends to get overlooked is the value of that tax deferral over time. If those registered accounts continue compounding for another 20 or 25 years, you're deferring that tax bill the entire time. So even though the eventual tax rate might be higher, the after-tax outcome can still come out ahead simply because that money had more time to grow. So now you've got two competing forces, a lower tax rate today versus more years of tax-deferred growth later. And depending on where someone starts, that trade-off can go either way. Which means the idea that you should always melt down your RRSP early doesn't really hold up. It works in some cases, and in others, it quietly does more harm than good. And that's usually the point where this starts to feel less like a strategy and more like a decision that has to be made in context. So if that's the case, what does getting this right actually look like? Not in theory, but in practice. Because the version of the RRSP meltdown that actually works isn't just about taking money out earlier. It's about how a few pieces come together at the same time. The first is the window, and for most people, the opportunity to do this properly sits between retirement and around age 70. That's the period where income is often lower because CPP and OAS don't have to be turned on just yet. And you actually have flexibility in how much income you report each year. Now, once you hit 71, that flexibility starts to disappear. Those RRIF minimums kick in, and from that point forward, part of the decision is being made for you. The second piece is the bracket itself. Not just taking money out, but being deliberate about where it lands. Thinking in terms of how much room there is in that middle range before the next layer of tax starts to apply, and then consistently using that same space each year. Not maximizing your withdrawals every year and not minimizing them either, just filling that band year after year. The third piece, and this is the one that's often missed, is what happens to the money once it comes out. Because in a lot of cases, that money isn't actually being spent. It's being repositioned, moved into a TFSA or into a non-registered account. And now you've taken something that was fully taxable in the future and you started shifting it into something that's not. And when those three pieces are working together, so the window, the bracket, and where the money actually goes next, that's when the strategy actually starts to change outcomes. And once you start looking at it that way, the RRSP meltdown stops being a tactic and starts becoming part of a much bigger income strategy. So here's the way I'd think about this going forward. Your RRSP isn't just a pool of money that you'll eventually draw down in retirement. It's a tax liability sitting on your balance sheet, growing every single year. And the only real question is whether you manage how and when that liability gets recognized or let it get decided for you later on. Because the RRIF minimum is the government's version of a meltdown. It starts at just over 5% at age 71, climbs into the 8s by your mid-80s, and then it keeps going up from there. And all it really does is force that income out at whatever tax rate you happen to be in at that time, which once CPP and OAS are fully in place, is usually higher than it needed to be. A coordinated approach looks different. It starts earlier, runs at a pace you control, and fits inside a change you're choosing deliberately. And when the excess doesn't need to be spent, it gets moved somewhere the CRA isn't waiting for it later on. So same retirement, same income, same lifestyle, but a very different tax result. And that's really what this comes down to. Now, a big part of why this works when it does comes down to what happens to the money after it comes out of the RRSP. Because if it's not spent, where it goes next starts to matter a lot. That's where the TFSA comes in. If you haven't watched our video on the TFSA yet, that's the next place I'd go. We break down how it actually fits into your retirement income strategy and how it connects to everything else we talked about here. I'll see you there.